Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight's shir is being sponsored by Hattie and Arthur Dubroff in memory of Muriel Dubroff, Minzel Bat Yaakov Yisrael, and Rose Silverman, Rachel Bat Chaim Baruch Halevi, and by Debbie and Ed Berliner in honor of the Teaneck Berliner women, Rachel and Kira, Ariella and Jill and Violet. So we're very excited tonight to have Shira Schiowitz, and I really hope I pronounced your name correctly. I'm really terrible with names. I apologize if I didn't get it right. But she's a Tanach teacher at SAR High School, where she also serves as co-director of professional development. She has taught Tanach at Mayanot Yeshiva High School, where she also chaired the Tanach department. She served as assistant dean and Lamdenu of Teaneck's first year, working on Lamdenu's opening. Shira is Rebbetzin of the Shaare Tefillah community, where she and her husband have served for the past 16 years. She received her master's in Bible at the Revel Graduate School. And we're really excited to hear tonight a shir on Shavuot and the ties of community. Before we start, I just thought it would be a good idea to do Tehillim, considering the terrible situation in Israel. So we're going to start with that, and then we will get started with the shir. So if everyone, again, could please mute.
Okay, thanks so much, Cheryl. So I have the honor of leading us in Tehillim. So we'll start with, we'll say Kuf Chaf Aleph, Shir Lamalo, which I think is, a familiar one. And then we'll say Achenu. So I guess since we're all on mute, since everyone's on mute except me, I'll say it out loud and we can, you can say it along with, and
I guess if you want, we can unmute for this, and then I can mute everybody, I think, afterwards. I'm not the most technical, but I'll figure it out.
Okay, so Shir Lamalod, Asainai El Harim, Me Ain Yavo Ezri, Ezri Me Im Adonai, Oseh Shamayim Va'aretz, Al Yitin Lamot Raglecha, Al Yanum Shomrecha, Hine Lo Yanum, Velo Yishan, Shomer Yisrael. Adonai Shomrecha, Adonai Tzilcha, Al Yad Yeminecha. Yomam Hashemesh Lo Yakeka V'Yareach Balayla. Adonai Yishmorcha Mikol Ra, Yishmor Et Nafshecha. Adonai Yishmor Tzidcha Uvoecha Me'ata V'Yad Olam. And I'm going to say Achenu. Achenu Kol Beit Yisrael Hanatunim Batzara Ubashivya Haomdim Bein Bayam Ubein Bayabasha. Hamakom Yirachim Aleihem B'Yotzim Mitzara L'Rvacha. Me'afela le'ora, me'shibud le'geula, hashta ba'agala uzman karib, ve'imu amin. Thank you. And also thank you to all the sponsors. I will give a little shout out to the Berliner women, because I know those women very well, and they are really wonderful people and neighbors. And I will say that I feel very connected. See, just seeing who's here, I already feel very connected to this West Orange community, because I'm a big fan of a lot of the families that are here. So thank you so much for having me. What I'd like to do tonight is talk about Shavuot. And in general, I find that I like to talk about what's on my mind, because I do find, as a Tanach teacher and someone who loves Tanach, Tanach connects to so many different situations. And so tonight, when I gave the title, when Cheryl asked me for a title, and I said Shavuot and the ties of community, I was thinking about community and how much that means to us, to me, and how hard that's been this past year to be so separate from community, and how hopefully we are kind of emerging from that process. I actually gave a shir last night, and it was my first in-person shir, not in my own shul, and it made me feel like we're getting there. Like there's, the community is starting to come together in the ways that we're used to. So I really want to reflect on that tonight, and how Megillat Ruth specifically, I think, talks about the importance of those bonds. So I want to start by mentioning a study by a psychologist named Mark Granovetter. And he studied what he was studying how important social ties are to people. And generally, he studied two types of relationships, what he called close ties. And close ties are exactly what we think, people who you see all the time, people who you connect to, people who you have a lot in common with, and you might have those more shared confidences with, who are with you in your day-to-day life. It could be family, it could be friends. Those are all those close ties, the strong ties. But he also talked about, he studied weak ties. And weak ties are people who are kind of at the other end of the spectrum. There may be people who, you have less in common with, people that you spend less time with, people that might not come into your mind necessarily until you bump into them. And then it's like, oh yeah, thinking about that person again. And what was interesting about this study, and I think why this study was kind of groundbreaking, was that in general, most people had thought, most studies had pointed to the importance of close ties. And we all know that's true intuitively, that the people that we're close to, family, friends, those are people that we feel like if we didn't have them in our life, we wouldn't know, we wouldn't know what to do next. Like they're our anchors. And it was generally thought that close ties were really really almost exclusively the most important piece. But what was interesting about this study was that what he found to be was that weak ties were actually much more important than we give them credit for. And the weak ties being like those outer circles, again, people that I know, but I probably don't have as much in common with, and I might not think about them readily. But what he actually found was that those weak ties were really important. He studied different pieces of it. So there's like the emotional piece, but he also found that these weak ties were really helpful for people in making connections, stability, social mobility. So there was a lot of back and forth since then, but that became like a pretty groundbreaking study. So I kind of want to use that as an opening anchor, and now bring that into the study of Megillat Ruth, because I found, thinking about that study and thinking about the importance, I would say, of a lot of these weak ties, in bringing just back to our current situation, we've maintained a lot more of the connections with our stronger ties. And our weaker ties, there are people who I haven't seen in the past year. A lot of those have fallen by the wayside. So thinking about that piece a lot, that, kind of missing all those weaker ties, I want to reinforce that with discussing a little bit about Megillat Ruth and how I think that Megillat Ruth, it doesn't use these words, but is actually a study of exactly that, the importance of the weak ties. And how to strengthen actually all those weaker ties, the outer circles of the community. So I'm going to break it down into like a few different parts of the Megillah, using this as the central anchor, and then we'll bring it back at the end to talk about kind of what, this year's Megillat Ruth, how it could resonate. So I think for many different reasons, there is the beginning of the book of Ruth is all about either active disengagement from the weaker ties or little effort invested into communal ties. And it's actually very powerful when you look at each of these examples, one after the other. So I'm going to screen share for a minute to show you a source sheet. I'll have Hebrew and English, so feel free to follow along with whatever is most comfortable for you. But I want to first take a few minutes to go through examples of how the beginning of the book of Ruth really shows a society that is pushing away all of those weak ties. So let me screen share, and just if you don't see it, please let me know, because I had this today where I tried to screen share and then nothing was there, and it took a few minutes till my students told me. So they were writing in the chat, but I didn't notice it. So just let me know if you don't see it. Okay, so let me just get this open. Sorry, hold on one second. Here it is. Okay. Do you see it? Linda, do you see it? Okay, great. Okay, Shavuot so here it is, Shavuot and the ties of community. So let me start off with how these weaker ties are established really right at the beginning. So the first thing here is like just that first opening pasuk of Megillat Ruth, Vayhi bimei shvot hashoftim, Vayhi ra'av ba'aretz, Vayelech ish mibet lechem Yudah lagor b'stei Moab, hu ishto shnei banav. So the beginning of the story, we have all these unnamed people in the beginning. We know it's the time of the judges and the judging of the judges. There's a famine. There's a famine, ironically, in a land called Beit Lechem. The land that should be filled with bread is all of a sudden empty of that. And a man, his wife, and 2 sons leave from that land in order to go to Moab, presumably for sustenance, to get food. So it actually, the very first thing that happens is A, a crisis, but B, a leaving, a rift in the community. One family leaving to go somewhere else because of this crisis. Now, Rashi quoting the Midrash, like it doesn't actually, what's interesting about Megillat Ruth all through is that very often it doesn't give us the motive of why this is happening. So we kind of get to read between the lines to figure it out. But let's take a look. This is a classic midrashic approach here. The Midrash says, why did he leave? Vayelech ish. So he says, Ashir gadol haya, ufarnes hador. Right. So he was a wealthy, important person. And he was, it says here, it's interesting, I'm looking at the English, it says he was a leader of the generation. But it's not only that he was a leader, that's actually ufarnas hador, means that he was someone who was supporting others. So then why would he have left? So he left because of a kind of like a stinginess, like a smallness that he didn't want to. Shahaita eno tzara ba'aniyim haba'im l'dachko l'chein ne'anash. So people he anticipated, or what was already happening, was that people who needed things were coming to him and asking for things, and he didn't want to be in that situation of giving. So certainly Chazal see this leaving of Elimelech and his family as a disconnect from the community, right? A breakdown to just the nuclear family in order to not support the community. Now, Chazal are basing this also on the fact that a lot of bad things happen to them in the next pasuk. They die. He dies. His sons die. But and they make that correlation between, well, if they died and there's nothing listed, they must have done something wrong. And that is one possibility that usually, very often, that's the equation in Tanach. Another possibility, by the way, is that they left because no one was helping them. And we have lots of other paradigms in Tanakh for that, where they, Yaakov and his sons, like going down, Abraham going to Egypt in order to get food. So we do have these paradigms of people also leaving in order to get food because they're hungry. So, but for one way or the other, the community structure isn't working, and there's a rift in this general bond of the community. The community is not able to support each other. Okay, so that's the first kind of breakaway. I'll just point out to you, we mentioned here that this is at the time period of the judges. It actually, even though in many ways this is like a very idyllic story, the book of Ruth, and it ends in a really happy way, and the book of Judges is actually kind of one of our lowest points in Jewish history, which ends with a really terrible story of the Pilegesh Begivah. But this initial like fracturing of the community is something that is really a poignant theme in Sefer Shoftim, the book of Judges in general. And just very briefly, I'll just, the story, Shoftim ends with a very terrible story of a man who, his Pilegesh ends up being raped by multiple men, and then he sends out a piece of her to all the different tribes. It's a really awful story. Like, you really don't get much more awful in Tanakh. But there's kind of just like this on the journey, like right before that incident happens, there's a very telling story of what was happening at the time. This man is, and this is from this source in Shoftim Yud Tet 19, this man is going down to, he's trying to get back home, and he's walking with his servant, and his servant says, we're close to the city of Yevus, and, it's the day's over, time to go to sleep. Let's see if we could spend the night here. And the man says to his servant, this is in Pasuk Yud Bet, right? We won't turn aside to a town of Nachriim, like non-Jews. They're not Israelites. We need to continue to the town of Israel, a town that's Jewish. And they continue on until they reach Giv'ah. But what happens when they get to Giv'ah? This is that last pasuk. It says, "Vayavo vayeshev barachov." So they're just sitting on the street of the city. Ve'ein ish ma'asef otam habayit lalun, but nobody takes them in. So this idea of the community not looking out for each other, perhaps in the Elimelech story, of not reaching out to the people in need, is also reflected in general in that time period of the Shoftim. So we really start the book with a lot of disintegration. The second case that I want to point you to is once Naomi comes back with Ruth. So we already have that whole scene where she's walking back from Beit Lechem, and from Moab, arriving at Beit Lechem. She keeps telling her daughter-in-laws to go back. Orpah finally turns and goes back. Ruth makes this amazing declaration. There's almost like nothing like that. It's such a powerful statement. And for us, it's also like the first things we hear her say is this tremendous declaration of faith and commitment to Naomi and the Jewish nation. Amech Ami, Elokayach Elokai. Your God is my God. I'll sleep where you sleep. Only death will us part. And then finally, Naomi lets her come. But then they keep walking. And a few interesting things happen here. So this is the very end of Perek Aleph. Naomi and Ruth arrive back in Beit Lechem. So it says here, Vatilachna shtehem ad boana Beit Lechem, vayhi kivoana Beit Lechem, vatahom kol ha'ir alehem. So they arrive and people notice. The whole city is like filled with wonder about them. It's a very funny word, like vatahom. It's interesting. I'm looking here. The Sephardic translation is the whole city buzzed with excitement over them. That's definitely not like such a literal translation of the word vatahom. I think I would call it more wonderment, but we'll talk about what the possibilities. It's really very ambiguous. It's hard to know what exactly motivates their reaction. But once they see Ruth and Naomi coming back, they say, Hazot Naami, right? Like, is this Naami? Now, first of all, there's no comment about Ruth. She's like kind of just out of the picture. But then they have such a funny, is this Naomi? And I just think it's fascinating that we don't really know what's behind those words. Now, it can be as simple as they're really struggling to recognize her. She looks different. She's been through a lot. It's been a famine. She's gone through a lot of losses. So perhaps they're really struggling to recognize her. But the Midrash sees it as a different kind of wonderment. So I'm going to go down to the next two sources, and we'll read out. I'll read this part in English. You can read along in Hebrew if you prefer. This is it from Ruth Rabbah. So again, the women said, can this be Naomi? So why are they wondering? She whose works are pleasant and pleasing, in times of the past, she was carried around on her litter, and now she's walking uncovered. And you say, can this be Naomi? In times past, she was covered in garments of very soft wool. Now she's covered in rags. In times past, her face was flushed from the strength of food and drink, and now her face is wan from hunger. So the explanation of the Midrash to this question is not a question of like, they're not sure if it's her because she looks different. It's more a question, it's a wonderment, meaning just noticing all the contrast that happened. And again, it's hard to say exactly what's behind it, but this stepping back and wondering almost seems like there's a piece of it that's like, just like, the way, the way I can almost relate to this myself is like, when there's like a celebrity who like falls from like their pedestal, and all of a sudden it's like they were at the top, and then, all these different news stories come out of it. And there's a sense of like, we're curious about it. Like we like to read about it. It fills up a lot of more of the news than really it should. So there's a sort of sense of wonder, like, how could it be that somebody who was so at the top is now low? And then the Gemara, I think, takes a little bit of a different spin. So the Gemara says, the Gemara here, over here, if you look in, I'm going to use again the translation. The Gemara asks, why did they say, is this Naomi? So they were asking, how does this indicate that her husband and sons were punished for leaving Eretz Israel? So Rabbi Yitzchak says, the women said, have you seen what befell Naomi, who left Eretz Israel for outside of Eretz Israel? Not only did she, this is a read-in a little bit from the Sephardic translation, but I think it's helpful. Not only did she not escape tribulations there, but she lost her status entirely. Meaning this is not only just a wonderment, but this is almost a highlighting of like, oh, look, this is what happened to Naomi. And she, yeah, I mean, that's kind of what she deserved, given what she did. Like, look what happens to the person who left Israel. It almost sounds to me, just to make two other like comparisons to other books in Tanakh, it's like the story of Job, when he loses everything, and then his friends come to visit him, and they try to explain, oh, it must have been this, oh, it must have been this. So there's a certain desire to connect. Oh, this is what happened. It must be because of what you did. And there's another association that this kind of reminds me of. In Shira Shirim, you also have this a female protagonist who's looking for her beloved, and she's chasing after him, trying to find him. He's trying to find her. They never meet. And at one point, I think this is in Perek Hay, it's a very dark Perek, and she's running outside looking for him. Some of the Parshanim comment that she was raped or really hurt violently by these people who are outside. And then she turns to these women, these Benot Yerushalayim, and she's like, have you seen him? Did you see him? And they like don't respond. And I always think about that as like, there are these female kind of bystanders here, just like commenting on the different situation. And there's a certain sense of disconnect. And there's also a sense of disconnect to Ruth, right? There's no mention of Ruth. She's almost like the elephant in the room that nobody wants to comment on. And it's not just the women in Beit Lechem who don't comment on Ruth, but Naomi herself says nothing about Ruth. And to the point, here I'm going to go back for a minute to that pasuk where they came and they said, Hazot Naami, is this Naomi? And Naomi responds to them in a very funny way. So the first thing she says is, don't call me Naomi, that's sweetness. My name should be bitterness because of everything I've suffered. But then in pasuk Chav Aleph, she says, Ani milea halachti verekam hashivani Hashem. Right? I left full and God has returned me empty. Lama tikra'ena li na'ami, Hashem anabi, etc. But she says, I left with so much and now I come back, I have nothing. I'm empty, right? Empty implies there's zero there. But that's not really true. She has a very devoted daughter-in-law who just told her that she will stick with her until the end. So there's something missing there in this recognition. In this case, once they come back, Naomi comes back with Ruth, but there's zero recognition of Ruth at all. And I would say that this is mirrored even, it's a little bit stronger, but in the next parak, when Ruth says to Naomi, I need to go get us food, so I'm going to go to glean in one of the fields. So she goes to one of the fields and Boaz notices her. And then in Perek Bet, Boaz turns to his field hands and he says to them, who is this woman? He notices her presumably because of what she's doing, who she is. And then in Pasuk Vav, in 6, Vaya'an hana'ar hanitzav al hakotrim vayomer, so his servant, the one in charge, responds, and she says she's na'ara Moaviyahi. She's a Moabite girl. Hashava im Naami mistei Moab, and she returned with Naomi from Moab. So her whole identity, meaning the women and Naomi originally ignored her, and now the Na'ar identifies her simply as she's a Moabite. It's not a surprise then that that's actually the way that Ruth ends up identifying herself. And once Boaz reaches out to her and says, you should come back to this field and stay with the women and I'll send you home with more food, Ruth is just shocked that he is attentive to her. And then he says over here in Pasuk Yud, she says, Vatipol paneha, so she falls down like in deference to Boaz. But Tomer Elav, Madua matzati chen beinecha lahakireni. Like, why do you even notice me? Why do you recognize me? Va'anochi nachriya. I'm a foreigner. I'm a stranger. Now, the truth is she's already made a commitment to be there. But in her eyes, she really is the true foreigner. So all these perceptions of Ruth lead to really the way that she perceives herself. I heard actually, here, I'll stop the screen share for just a moment, but I heard actually that I heard a poem that by an Israeli poet. Her name is Ignava Segal. I heard who read it. It was a shir on Ruth, and it was with I think it was Orit Avneri, and she read this poem in Hebrew, and then they translated it. And it's a very beautiful poem that kind of reads in what may have been happening at that time between Ruth and Naomi, and why does Naomi really push Ruth away? So I'm just going to read you a few lines from it because it captures that we're not really sure why she's ignoring Ruth and why she's pushing her away. So here's what she writes. It's called, by the way, the poem is titled The Convert. Don't go with me, Ruth. By myself, I'll cross the border. Alone, I will go. Let us part now before it's too late. I must leave, but you can still retreat. On the other side, a foreign land awaits. There, they'll point their fingers, call you names. Wherever you walk, you'll be tarnished by shame. A stranger in my land, I'm worried and scared. It's hard to forget and forgive. On your wall, they will write, here a foreign woman lives. And I would say the poem is even more, it continues. That's like the beginning of it. It's definitely, for those of you who are Hebrew speakers, it's definitely a very powerful poem to read in Hebrew. But what I think, I mean, I like the creative enterprise of it, of like trying to get into like Naomi's head at that moment, what she's thinking. But I think there is a little bit of a question. Is she trying to protect Ruth, like by sending her back? Or is she trying, which is what she's saying initially, or is she also trying to protect herself? You know, she's coming back with this woman and she's a foreigner. She's different than everybody. She might look different than everybody. How is that going to work with the integration? So it's unclear whether Naomi is like kind of self-protecting or she's trying to protect Ruth, but there is definitely this alienation. So we start out with all of these ties between community as very weak. First of all, right, there's a rift. Elimelech and his family leave. They leave their community. Once Naomi and Ruth comes back, nobody really takes them in. You know, Hazot Naami did not come along with like a meal plan, you know, or a meal train. Like, let's get them something to help them. It's only Ruth who initiates that. And then there seems to be also this like either this rejection of Ruth or a like not reaching out to her. So we start out with all these ties of community, very, very frayed. And the truth is that it's really Ruth who puts things into place to make the situation better. And I want to highlight kind of first the positives in Megillat Ruth, how some of these different situations are repaired. And I think actually one of the most powerful things about Ruth is that it's really short. It's 4 prakim. It's really like a short story, but there's so much development in the characters and specifically the main characters who are flawed people, Boaz and Naomi, but they both develop so much over the course of just a really short, beautiful story that it's a very inspiring journey. So I wanted to show you the 2 ways that kind of Ruth forces the growth of these 2 characters. So I'm going to screen share again. Okay, so we'll do, let's see, let's talk just briefly about Ruth first. So the last thing we know is that, hang on, let me just see if I put in the source. Oh, I see what I did. I did Boaz first. I'm going to I'm going to skip down. I'll do. Okay. Yeah. So Ruth is the first one who takes action. And what I think is so startling about this also is that, like, just in the context that nobody recognizes her. From what we know in the Megillah, Naomi is struggling and she's not reaching out to her. But finally, Ruth is the one who says, you know, I need to go and get food. You know, we're starving. And she takes that initiative despite being rejected to go there. And if you look at the end of this pasuk in Ruth Bet, pasuk Bet, it says, Vatomer la lichi biti. And there's that change in tone where all of a sudden Naomi calls her my daughter. It's like such a powerful moment because she was sending her away. She didn't respond to the declaration, but they're desperate now and Ruth's willing to do something. And this brings them together. After that, so she's open to Ruth's help. So the first thing that happens is that she takes the initiative to do something, and Naomi allows it. Once Ruth comes back and she brings the food, and she also reveals this kind of serendipitous, coming to the field of somebody who they're related to, then Naomi has a moment of faith, a declaration. Naomi is faithful, but in Parak Aleph, she's angry about the things that have happened, and she's angry at Hashem also. She says Hashem has embittered me, but now she responds differently after Ruth and Ruth's kindness to her. So Vatomer Naami, this is in Pasuk Chaf, L'kalata, to her daughter-in-law. So there's that relationship again. Baruch hu Hashem asher lo azav chasto et hachayim v'et hametim. Ruth, this like reaching out of Ruth allows her to see once again Hashem's hand in her life. I thought I was left. I thought I had nothing. I thought Rekam Hashibani Hashem left me empty. But actually, I see through what you did that I'm not really deserted. And ultimately, so he kind of is like, first is her acceptance of the relationship. She calls Ruth BT and she accepts Ruth's help. Ruth's help allows her to recognize God's presence in her life again in a helpful way. And then ultimately, she's able to have that reciprocal relationship. And that's here in source 13, in beginning of Parak Gimel, where Ruth says where Naomi says to Ruth, BT, Halo avakesh lecha manoach asher yitablach. I need to find some stability and a home for you. It's not just about me. It's not just about, I'm able to move out of my pain and I'm able to think about the other. So Ruth really becomes, and she uses again that language of my daughter. So Ruth really becomes the agent of allowing Naomi to receive kindness, to see Hashem in her life, and to give kindness. Now, Ruth does, by the way, the same thing, a similar kind of reaction to Boaz. So here, let me go back for a minute, because I think I had it up here. When Ruth first goes to Boaz, here, Boaz comes to her, and she says, right, we read that, she says, why are you even noticing me? And he says, oh, Ruth, of course I noticed you. I heard about all these great things that you did, that you left your birthplace and you followed to come after, your mother-in-law. So, and then he responds in Pasuk Yud Bet, Yishalem Hashem pa'alech. God should repay you. And Hashem should give you a full reward because you have sought refuge under the wings of God. So he says, you deserve blessings and God should bless you for that. And the truth is, in some ways, Boaz does go above and beyond. But Ruth also kind of teaches him that he hasn't really taken full responsibility. And she does that by using his language, but turning it on its head. And then when she ultimately comes to him, because he says, keep coming back, I'll make sure that you have food. But he hasn't really given stability to Ruth or Naomi. So when she comes back to him and she comes into the threshing floor in the middle of the night, this is Ruth Parak Gimel, in the middle of the night, and she wakes him up, and all of a sudden there's a strange woman at his feet. Vayomer mi'at, who are you? And by the way, I think this is a different question of this mi'at is a different question than hazot na'ami, because here he's asking, who are you? I know you, but tell me who you are. What are your intentions? And she says, I'm Ruth, anochi Ruth amatecha, ufarasta knafecha al amatecha ki goel ata. I'm Ruth, and you need to spread your wings on me because you are my redeemer. Now, if you remember Boaz's language before, when Boaz recognized everything Ruth had done before, he said, God should take you under his wings. Ruth turns that on its head, and she says, no, it's not God who needs to do this. It's you, Boaz. And it's interesting that both Naomi and Boaz, when they talk about chesed at the beginning of the book, they talk a lot about Hashem's chesed. And Hashem's chesed is a big theme in Megillat Ruth. But what Ruth teaches everybody is that, yes, there's Hashem's chesed, but you need to actualize that. You need to imitate Hashem's chesed. Human chesed is what's going to help us get out of this situation with Hashem's help. But it requires the human piece. And I think to Ruth, to Boaz and Naomi's credit, they're both really able to receive that message in a very powerful way. And I would say even the women, right, who stood on the sidelines, let's see, the women at the end, they also finally noticed, the same women who ignored Ruth at the beginning, now in Perek Daled say, Vatomarna Nashim El Naami, Baruch Hashem Asher Lo Ishbit Lecha Goel Hayom, right? We bless Hashem for giving you this Goel, this Redeemer. The name of this child will be perpetuated, perpetuate the names of your son. And then they say about Ruth, this child will renew you because he was born from your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons. So there's a recognition here of who Ruth is and all that she's done. So we kind of, the way the Megillah does it so beautifully is it kind of brings together full circle all these people who at the beginning were struggling to recognize Ruth because of her foreignness, because she's a convert, because she's a poor woman who doesn't have, a husband to support her. And because the community, the weaker ties in the community seem to be falling by the sidelines. But all these people, right, her relatives and also the people at the sidelines seem to be coming forward for her. Now, it's interesting. I was just thinking, I don't know, have any of you read the book? I know it's a popular book now and I'm in the middle of it, 4 Winds by Kristen Hanna. Oh, yes. Okay. So at least one person has read it. So I'm going to say something about it. I actually think it's a really great book to read around Shavuot. It has so much in common with the story of Ruth. So 2 things that I would point out to you is, first of all, the mother. It's a story about the Great Depression. It's a very beautiful and sad story, but very, very powerful. And the first thing is that the story begins with a woman who becomes pregnant and then comes into her husband-to-be's family, and they don't want her. She's not from their community. She's not, this wasn't the way it was supposed to be. He was supposed to go to college, and her mother-in-law meets her on the first day. And I love this scene. And she's really is not happy about the situation, but she takes her in because it's the right thing to do. But over time, their bond becomes, as she sees like what a person of quality Elsa, the main character, is, their bond becomes like a daughter and a mother. Not even with, not as even like what we, call a mother-in-law. It's like a really close bond. And it just mirrored to me so much about like that relationship between Ruth and Naomi, that it doesn't necessarily start right at the beginning, but after time, when people are there for each other, that happens. And the other piece that also jumped out at me is about the importance of friendship and women being there for each other. And part of what gets Elsa through this like very difficult, she becomes a migrant, which is also similar to Ruth. She has to work in the field. So there's really, I don't know, the parallels are kind of startling. But she, in the end, she also makes these women friends who become supportive of her, and she supports them. And it also shows the power of like kind of the bigger community, not just family, and how it could be supportive. So as I'm reading this book and I'm thinking about these strong bonds in I definitely recommend it. It almost like tells, I don't even know if that's something that, the author thought about. She doesn't have a nice Jewish name, so I don't know that it's a book that was based on that, but it has a lot of similarities to kind of like communities healing through this process. But I want to just, I think that Ruth doesn't end necessarily all rosy. And I want to just highlight that for a minute, because I think then the Megillah is giving us a message, right? So like, what's the Megillah's message to society? What's it trying to say about society? So I think when the Megillah writes this story and about these like rifts in families and communities and the healing that happens, it's setting up an aspiration of like what can be, what can be achieved. And it sets that up by setting up almost like these different role models. Now, Ruth, in a way, I find, this is just me, is sometimes like she's like this perfect character from the get-go. In a way it's almost hard to relate. She's so powerful, like her faith, her commitment, her balance in activism, her integration, it's just, she's like just this amazing figure. But it also gives us, I think the Megillah sets up a different type of role model with Boaz and Naomi, role models who are good, caring people, but who are open, but who grow over the course of the Megillah and recognize the importance of community, like really coming back to the community, stepping up to responsibility, to family members, and to the broader community as well. Right? Boaz taking in Ruth and marrying Ruth also made a statement to his community about converts and how they should be treated and how Ruth should be brought in. So through Ruth, they come back to family and they come back to community. But I also think that it's very deliberate that we have other characters in the Megillah also. Right? We didn't really talk about Orpah, who turns back. And certainly, I think she gets a bad rap in the Midrash, where Orpah is that she turned her neck and, she wasn't there. She followed Naomi, she followed her lead, and then she left when Naomi told her to go. So she doesn't, I think she strikes me as just a very normal human character, a human person, not necessarily as an evil person. But I think she sets up kind of like what would most people do. And we have the other person in the story, Ploni Almoni, the unnamed man, who is set up when Boaz marries Ruth, before he can marry her and redeem her by acquiring the field that belonged to Elimelech's family, and also having a child with Ruth, which would be the Yibum ceremony and give continuity to the children that Naomi lost, Machlon and Kilion. First, that opportunity of redemption goes to the closer relative. Now, it's fascinating that this closer relative is the only unnamed person in the Megillah. We don't know his name. He's called Ploni Almoni, John Doe, Mr. So-and-so. And the Megillah is making a statement by saying, you see, he was so worried about his name. He was so worried to bring Ruth into his life. But in the end, he's the one who doesn't even get a name. He's unnamed in the Megillah. But I think it sets those up. I think the statement of the Megillah is that there are role models. Role models could teach us, like role models can like kind of bring us close and teach values. But there's also, we've made progress, they make progress, but there's also a ways to go. For every Boaz, there's a Ploni Almoni. And I ask myself, had I been in that situation, would I have been Boaz or would I have been Ploni Almoni? And I can't really say for sure. And I think the advice of the Megillah is keep working towards that. Surround yourself with people who motivate you to do that. But that it's not a sure, it's a very realistic, I think. We see a beautiful zone in on these very inspirational people, but we also see a kind of realistic picture of society with tangible advice about what it means and how to be there for people. And as I said, I think the Megillah stresses the importance of these weak ties, because there's so many reasons in the Megillah that people disconnect from others. There's certainly like a self-preservation, physical, emotional. There's fear of somebody who's different. There's also ignorance, perhaps not knowing what the status of Ruth was. There's maybe a moral superiority, like, well, if this happened to you, I can't relate. But I think the Megillah is really going out of its way to say that those weak ties are critical, and we have to remove some of the judgment and make the effort to bring them back in. Now, the reason I think this felt so relevant to me at this time was because I think that I'm reflecting on myself. Relationships became a risk-benefit analysis to some degree over the past year. There was and still is less, but a real health risk. So we cut down on getting together. And I think two things, we stopped, I haven't been in shul in, a year. I used to see in shul was where I would notice people who maybe were, I just didn't bump into them all the time. And then they became back into my head, into my circle. I had those interactions with them. The same for me. If I was, something was going on, that was when people might have noticed that I had something going on. So we lost a lot of our communal events. I think also though, there's and when I say that risk benefit analysis, there was also this pairing through of like, well, do I really need all these people? And aren't there benefits to not having as many people in my life? Now I noticed this, I don't know if anyone saw this in the Sunday Review in the Times like 2 weeks ago. There was an article and it was called like an opinion piece that said, the pandemic shrank our social circles. Let's keep it that way. Did anyone see it? Okay, so I'll just, if this was the way, it was a whole article about, and there's something real to this that, well, let me read you. This is what the person was arguing. So I'll read you just 2 paragraphs on it. She said, once you don't have that external forces making your contact frequent, you start realizing, you know what? We really didn't have that much to talk about. And come to think of it, we haven't actually confided anything deeply personal outside of that particular context. Friends don't just happen. You have to put in the effort. And part of that is realizing who makes you feel comfortable and connected and who makes you feel pinched and awkward, like those stiletto heels or business suits you wore before the pandemic and now wonder how you ever stood it. Many have a guilty reluctance about things returning to the way they were. It sounds terrible, said Mary, but I like the peace that comes with not having to run around. I've been able to have fewer and deeper friendships, and I want to hold on to that. And there is this piece of that argument that there is a certain degree of like, you know, life has been in certain ways more restful. Relationships, you know, we were able to kind of sift through and think about which relationships felt very meaningful and hold on to them. But I think there's a piece here that we're moving, this is what the Megillah seems to be telling me, that we're moving away from what the ideal religious community really looks like. Because the ideal religious community in my mind, and basing this also on Megillah root, is diverse. It has multi-generations. You know, it's not just people in the same age group, like spending time together because of shared experience. It has diversity in religious experience. And yet, despite that, it's people who care for each other and learn from each other. And I think that these weaker ties, it's not the inner circle that I'm talking about, but these outer circles of community give us a chance to connect with others and also support and be supported by a broader community. So my hope for Shavuot and being inspired by the coming together of the broader community and the family in Megillah root is that with, you know, greater physical health now, as we kind of are able to come together physically, that we can also reconvene and renew our emotional appreciation of all the things that we gain, not just from our closest and strongest ties, but also from the weaker and broader ties of community. So thank you, and wishing you a Chag Shavuot Sameach.